Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. For the last few years, Americans have gotten used to arguing about free speech at home. We debate social media moderation, campus speech, misinformation, hate speech, and where the line should be between private platforms and government power. That debate is already intense enough inside the United States. But recently, something different has started to happen. The free speech debate is no longer just domestic. It's becoming international, especially between the United States and Europe. Most Americans still think of Europe as a close ally with shared democratic value. And in many ways, that's still true. But when it comes to speech, regulation, and the role of the state in shaping public discourse, the gap between the American and European approaches has been growing for years. Lately, that gap has become much harder to ignore. A question I want to explore today is not whether Europe is right or America is right. It's something more basic. Are the United States and Europe still operating under the same assumptions about what free speech actually is? Or are we slowly drifting toward two fundamentally different models of democracy? Is a culture war video? It's not about dunking on Europe or defending Silicon Valley. It's about understanding a real policy and values conflict that's already affecting technology, elections, diplomacy, and civil liberties. The immediate trigger for this discussion was a recent and fairly unusual move by the United States government. Visa restrictions and sanctions targeting several European individuals connected to speech regulation and online content enforcement. That kind of action is rare between allies, and it raised eyebrows on both sides of the Atlantic. To be clear, this wasn't about trade defense or security. It was about speech specifically. Whether certain European laws and enforcement practices were crossing a line by pressuring American platforms and American speech norms beyond Europe's borders. That alone should tell you something important. When democratic allies start using sanctions over speech policy, it means the disagreement isn't technical anymore. It's philosophical. To understand why, we need to take a step back and talk about how differently the United States and Europe think about free expression. In the American constitutional tradition, free speech is treated as a foundational right. Not because speech is always good or polite or responsible, but because the alternative is worse. The First Amendment is built on the idea that government should not be trusted to decide which ideas are acceptable. The assumption is that bad ideas are best defeated by better ones, not by legal suppression. That doesn't mean speech in America is unlimited. There are exceptions, direct threats, incitement to imminent violence, fraud, defamation. But the bar for government intervention is extremely high. And culturally, Americans tend to see speech restrictions as dangerous, even when the intentions sound reasonable. Europe approaches this very differently, and it's important to understand why. European countries carry historical memories that the United States does not. Fascism, Nazism, ethnic violence, and total war are not abstract concepts there. They are lived history. As a result, many European democracies place a higher value on preventing social harm, even if that means limiting certain forms of expression. In much of Europe, speech is viewed not only as an individual right, but also as a social responsibility. If speech is seen as contributing to hatred, discrimination, or instability, governments are more willing to regulate it. This is not new. Laws against hate speech and extremist expression have existed in Europe for decades. What is new is the scale and scope of enforcement in the digital age. With the rise of global platforms, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, European regulators are no longer just policing speech within their own borders. They are increasingly pressuring companies to remove or suppress content globally, or to change algorithms and moderation practices in ways that affect users for outside Europe. The European Union's Digital Services Act is the clearest example of this shift. Supporters argue that it's a necessary response to misinformation, online abuse, and the power of large tech companies. Critics argue that it creates vague standards, grants regulators broad discretion, and risks turning political disagreement into a compliance problem. From an American perspective, one concern keeps coming up. When European regulators decide what counts as harmful or misleading speech, whose standards are they using, and should those standards apply to Americans? This is where the conflict becomes unavoidable. In the United States, there is deep skepticism toward any system that allows government agencies to define acceptable political speech. Even well-intentioned regulation can look like censorship once it starts shaping public debate. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that Europe is not acting in bad faith. European policymakers genuinely believe that unchecked online speech can destabilize democracies, fuel extremism, and undermine social cohesion. From their point of view, doing nothing is not neutrality, it's negligence. The disagreement is not between democracy and authoritarianism. It's between two democratic traditions that prioritize different risks. Americans tend to fear government overreach more than social harm. Europeans tend to fear social harm more than government overreach. The problem is that these two approaches don't coexist easily in a global internet. When a European regulator pressures a platform to remove content, that decision often affects American users, American political debates, and American elections. When American platforms resist, Europe accuses them of irresponsibility or political bias. When the US pushes back, Europe sees it as interference. This is why some American lawmakers, particularly but not exclusively on the conservative side, have started framing the issue as a free speech conflict rather than a regulatory dispute. They argue that Europe's approach, whatever its intentions, risks exporting a more restrictive speech regime into the American public sphere. That argument has gained traction because it connects to broader concerns Americans already have about platform power, government pressure, and the blurring line between private moderation and state influence. There's also a political layer to this. Europeans often accuse American platforms of amplifying extremism or misinformation, especially during elections. Americans, meanwhile, worry that European institutions are becoming arbiters of political legitimacy, deciding which viewpoints are dangerous and which are acceptable. Recent controversies around election-related speech, political labeling, and algorithmic visibility have only intensified these concerns. Even when actions are justified as protecting democracy, they raise uncomfortable questions about who gets to define democratic boundaries. It's also worth noting that Europe is not monolithic. Different countries apply speech laws differently, and there is real debate within Europe itself. Civil liberties groups, journalists, and legal scholars have raised concerns about overreach, selective enforcement, and the chilling effect on dissent. This is not a settled issue even there. Still, from the American mainstream perspective, the direction of travel matters. When police investigations, fines, or legal threats are tied to online speech, especially political speech, it triggers alarm bells rooted deeply in American history. This brings us back to the broader question: are the US and Europe still aligned on the basic role of speech in a democracy? For most of the post-war period, the answer was assumed to be yes. Differences existed, but they were seen as variations within a shared liberal framework. Today, that assumption is under strain. The United States continues to treat free expression as a near sacred principle, even when it produces messy or uncomfortable outcomes. Europe increasingly treats speech as one variable among many to be balanced against safety, dignity, and social order. Neither approach is cost-free. Absolute speech protections can enable abuse, radicalization, and misinformation. Heavy regulation can suppress legitimate dissent and concentrate power in the hands of regulators. A risk is not that one side is evil and the other virtua. The risk is that the two sides stop understanding each other's red lines. For Americans, the red line is government deciding which political ideas are too dangerous to be expressed. For Europeans, the red line is allowing speech that they believe threatens democratic stability or minority rights. When those red lines collide on global platforms, conflict is inevitable. What makes the current moment especially sensitive is the growing sense, fair or not, that speech regulation is becoming entangled with political outcomes. Once citizens believe that content moderation is shaping elections or public opinion, trust erodes quickly. This is why free speech debates are no longer just legal or technical. They're existential. They go to the heart of whether democratic systems can survive deep disagreement without resorting to control. From a mainstream American point of view, the key concern is not Europe's motives, but the precedent. If democratic governments normalize broad speech regulation in the name of safety or truth, the scope of acceptable dissent will inevitably narrow over time. History suggests that power rarely shrinks once expanded. At the same time, Americans should be cautious about assuming moral superiority. The U.S. has its own struggles with platform censorship, informal pressure, and politicized enforcement. Free speech is not just threatened by laws, it's threatened by social and economic coercion as well. Oh, the real issue isn't America versus Europe. It's whether liberal democracies can maintain open discourse in an age of digital amplification, polarization, and fear. Recent tensions between US and European approaches to speech should be seen as a warning sign. Not that one side is abandoning democracy, but that democracy itself is under strain. If allies can no longer agree on the basic rules of public debate, cooperation becomes harder, trust erodes, and citizens on both sides grow more cynical. The path forward probably isn't a single unified standard. Different societies will make different trade-offs. But transparency, humility, and restraint matter. So, does recognizing that protecting democracy sometimes means tolerating speech we deeply dislike? Ultimately, the question isn't whether free speech should have limits. It's who decides those limits, and how easily that power can be abused. That question doesn't belong to Europe alone. It belongs to the United States, too. And the way we answer it will shape the future of democratic discourse far beyond social media.